Hey, thanks for clicking on the sermon recap for today. Last night we started a new series. We're going to be walking through Genesis, looking at the patriarchs. We started in chapter 12 last night. And of course, if you're familiar with that, you know that we looked at Abram, who would later become Abraham. We're going to see God call Abram to a new land, out of a land where he just settled, where he had just moved there with his entire family, with his father. He had gotten established. And God comes in the scene, and in chapter 12, he says, "Go," and he said, "I'm gonna give you a great nation, make your name great, bless you, and all these things." But one of the things that we see when God says "Go" is He doesn't tell him where. Not only that, we see that He says things like, "I'm going to make you a great nation," and all these different things. But if we back up to the end of chapter 11, we see there might be a problem with that. There's a few problems actually. Number one, his wife was barren. She could not have children. So already out of the gate, it seems like God's request is impossible. We see that he was settled. He was established there. He was now in charge of a lot of things because Daddy had passed away. It says that his father had passed away. And we see that he was old. Chapter 12, verse 4 tells us that he was about 75. Now he's going to live to be 175, but nevertheless, he's still old. And so we see right out of the gate when God talks about this offspring that Abraham's going to have and this great nation that he's going to have, sure, we can get excited, and I'm sure the ancient readers, when they got to this part of Genesis, were excited, but they also thought, well, this seems impossible. And that was kind of the theme of the message. Even though things are impossible, they're not impossible to God. And the title was, When God Prescribes, He Provides. We just have to have faith. I use the analogy of taking medicine. When we go to the doctor, many times we're prescribed medicine, antibiotics, whatever the case may be. But if we just take that medicine and admire it and worship it and praise it, but we don't actually put it into our bodies, I don't know about you, but I don't think it works. Maybe you've had a story where you've just looked at medicine and thought it was so good, but never took it, and it worked, but I don't believe that's the case. And I said, I fear in the same way that a lot of us sometimes admire God, we admire the things of God, we'll even admit that God is great. But we don't actually take His prescription. We don't actually have God within us. We don't abide in Him. And listen, if we don't tap into the power of what God can do by spending time in His Word, by prayer, and ultimately by salvation, well, then nothing's going to matter. And here we see God tell Abram to go. He didn't tell him where, but Abram went. First thing we see is God prescribes, verse 1 through 3 says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Now, we see God not giving suggestions here, but He gives promises. If you do this, then this will happen. He also gives the results of what will happen. Great nation, blessings, name great, all these different things. And he just told him, we just learned at the end of chapter 11 that Sarah, his wife, can't have children. So this already seems impossible. But God prescribed it, and He's going to provide for it. And I asked the students, I said, I wonder if sometimes we don't take that step of faith because things seem impossible, right? They don't look to us, they don't look practical, they don't look like we can do them, so we don't even give it a shot. When we forget that God, through Him, nothing is impossible. And point number 2, we see Abraham obey. 3 strong words at the beginning of verse 4. So Abram went. He went without knowing where to go. Do we always want to know where to go when God says go? Right? Maybe we're willing to go, or we say that, but we say, well, where? We want the steps. We want it planned out. We want it to look practical. We want it to make sense. But that's not what God wanted here. He wanted just all-out surrender and faith without Abraham knowing the full plan, as He does for you and I. But some of us still have this idea that we need to know where to go. We also have this idea that when God calls us to something, it's going to be easy. We do not see that here with what God called Abram to do. He called him to leave his land, but not only that, He called him to take his whole family. Now, I asked the youth, I said, you ever been on a trip with your family? Maybe your extended family on a vacation? Boy, those are always fun, right? A lot of different opinions sometimes on those trips, and sometimes they can get a little uncomfortable and get a little irritating. And I said there was no indication that this would have been any different with Abraham's family. They wouldn't have understood that God called him out of this place. It might have not made sense to them. So he had to take his whole family, all his possessions. I said there was no U-Haul for Haran. He had to load them up on these camels and all these different things, and then go on a tough journey through a tough terrain, tough desert terrain in the hot sun and the cold nights. Without adequate clothing and shoes like we have today, yet he still did it. He went. And I said, some of us have this fairy tale that things get easier when God calls us to something, or that things get easier when we get saved. There's no indication of that at all in Scripture. In fact, it says things will be tougher when we surrender our life to Christ. The difference is when you're in obedience to God and inside of His will, you'll have joy that surpasses all understanding and a peace that surpasses all understanding, because you know you're working for something larger than yourself and for an eternity that's coming. So here we see God call Abram to some hard things. We also see Him, though, promise him again for his offspring, and we see God promise, this is the land that I'll give you for your offspring, and Abram just stops and worships. He builds an altar in the middle of his journey. It led me to another question for the youth. Do we ever just stop and worship God? Or are our times of worship always scheduled? We say, well, I'll worship God at 11 on Sunday during the worship service, and at 6:30 on Wednesday night during our Bible study, or at this time when we sing. But we never sometimes just stop in the middle of our journey, in the middle of our life, just to worship God, to remember what He's done, to thank Him for that we have breath to breathe today, and to serve Him more. There's a great example Abram gives here, just stopping and building an altar. But just when things were going great, and Abram seems like he was doing everything right, he strays. Abraham strays, and it's at the perfect time, because he might have been feeling a little prideful, right? He's obeyed God. He's went to this land out of his own land. He's followed all the directions, and maybe he was getting a little prideful, and it was test time. We see him. We see a famine come to the land. The very first words of Genesis 12:10. Now there was a famine in the land. Now the same God that just called him out of his homeland caused this famine as well. There's an application point for us there. God will test us when He thinks we need it. When our faith needs to grow, maybe when we need to point more, our lives need to point more back to Him. So we see the famine come, and instead of Abraham responding in simple obedience and trust, he does the thing that he shouldn't do. He goes down to Egypt. He goes down to Egypt to try to figure some things out. Of course, if you're not familiar with this, he goes into Egypt. He lies about Sarah being his just full sister instead of his wife and sister, and there's a lot to unpack there about how the culture was in those days. Either way, sells his wife to Pharaoh for possessions for himself, really without a care. Gains a lot of selfish gain. At this point, that should have been the end of the story, right? Abram, the human vessel, has messed it all up, and there you go. God can't use him. But of course, we don't see that. We see God intervene. He kind of gets on Pharaoh a little bit. Not the last time you're going to see God intervene with a Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, hey man, why didn't you tell me about this? He gives him his wife back. And not only that, all the possessions he gave him, he sent him back. Now, by all means, pharaohs in this day, that was their title. They were very brutal, right? There's no reason he should have let him go like this. But he did, because God intervened. We see Abram have fear and worry and lie and be selfish. However, we learn at this point that though we may have thought Abram was the hero of the story, he's not. God is the hero, because our last point was that God saves. He swooped in and saved Abram from what should have been sure death, because his plans were going to be fulfilled. When we take a step of faith and follow Christ, we can rest assured that God has a plan for our life. And from that point on, we can either get on board with the plan or we can fight the plan. But either way, God's plan is going to happen. We can make things a little easier on ourselves by submitting humbly each day and saying, Lord, whatever your will is, let me do that. Or we can fight it and be miserable and have to go through chastening more and more. But it's not because God wants to do that. He just wants us to be inside of His will so that He will be glorified and so that we will be joyful. But do we trust that? Maybe what has God prescribed you that you're not being obedient to? Maybe some of you He's called into the ministry. Maybe some of you just to share the gospel with that coworker or that friend. And you know God's calling you to that, but you keep running, you keep getting off path, and maybe He has to get you there. And for some of you, He may be calling you to salvation, and you keep rejecting it. Whatever the case may be let's just stop admiring how great God is and actually do the things He's asked us to do. That's actually the next step in admiration, is obedience. That's what He desires. The last thing I'd ask you is, does God still have control of your life, or are you trying to take that too? When Abram went to Egypt, he tried to control the situation. He thought he had it figured out, but God had to intervene to get the plan back on course. Maybe you've encountered a type of famine in your life and you're not trusting, but you're trying to figure things out by what you can do, when we know that all of our pursuits are vain efforts. So I encourage you, and I end with this as I did in my youth. Though it seemed impossible for Abram to be able to have a kid, to be able to leave his homeland, to be able to travel and fulfill this great promise God was going to use through him, though that seemed impossible, God prescribed it and He provided it. And let's not forget this. There was one more thing that was impossible. The fact that we as worthless sinners could be reconciled to a holy God. But God intervened on that one too, didn't He? He sent His Son Jesus to die for us and to defeat death. And if we place our faith in Him, we will be saved. That was impossible, but God done that as well. Never forget that, and never forget the story of Abram. And we're going to continue trucking on with him and through his journey. And I hope that this has blessed you today, and that the sermon recap can either fill you in if you missed, or if you don't even go here, just give you a good word today. But if I had anything to leave you with, when God prescribes, He provides. Don't look at the impossibilities. Just look at the God who's telling you to do it. Hey, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.